Hello, and welcome to the workings of investigative journalism. Throughout this presentation, I will go through the ins and outs of the industry. To start, I will go through what is investigative journalism. Investigative journalism focuses on diving deeper into current issues and stories within the public's interest. It involves thorough research, analysis, reporting, editing, and presenting to become successful. Another name for investigative journalism is watchdog journalism, which emphasises the amount of time and work that goes into this part of the industry. It takes multiple people with various skills to produce an effective piece of journalism. However, investigative journalists usually take up the role of in-depth research and often act as a middleman for other journalists. They often require access to documents such as lawsuits, legal documents, tax records, and government reports for a thorough investigation. Audience. Journalism is such a large industry with many types such as radio, television, and magazines. Investigative journalism can often play a role in them all. You could go day to day without realising that the content you're reading, watching, or listening to is investigative journalism. From TV to radio, investigative journalism targets adults due to the sensitive or serious content that it exposes. These types of journalists uncover sensitive topics such as crime, conflict, and war, meaning that it is not suitable for young audiences. This graph created by Ofcom shows that newspapers, online or printed, and television are more popular news platforms for the ages 45 to 75 plus. These are both common platforms for investigative journalism to be published. Where did investigative journalism begin? Well, William Thomas Stead was a huge influence in the investigative journalism industry in the 18th century. He was a newspaper editor and published multiple campaigns regarding child prostitution in the Pall Mall Gazette, which was a popular newspaper at the time. His work was so influential that the age of consent was changed from 13 to 16 years old. This movement was named after him and is called the Stead Act. His investigation into child prostitution in 1885 is essentially what began the investigative journalism industry. During that time, tabloids typically published basic information on the news, advertisement, and fiction. Therefore, this was a huge opportunity for the industry to influence and educate the public. The famous journalist died in 1912 on the Titanic and ironically made newspaper headlines. The investigative journalism industry today. The journalism industry can be very deceiving. It is very easy to overlook what you read online. Even I'm guilty of this. I think many people are guilty of this. And I think that many people dismiss the amount of work that goes into publishing stories. And after reading into investigative journalism in more detail, I have realised how dangerous and risky this job can be. Investigative journalism is a very expensive form of journalism, mainly due to the intensity and cost of the labour. For a detailed investigation, it may take years to gather the information that they need for a story, creating an expensive labour for their employer. Or, for freelancers, it means that their income depends on one story alone, and they may not be able to begin another story until the current one is finished due to an overwhelming workload. This particular type of journalism is risky for those involved. When focusing on sensitive topics relating to crime, such as fraud or corruption, it is important to be careful with what you do and do not publish. Reporting content that could cause harm to a person or something that isn't entirely correct, you could be at risk of a lawsuit. For example, in 2022, Aaron Banks, who is the co-founder of the Leave EU campaign, attempted to sue Carol Cadwallader, an investigative journalist, for allegedly reporting defamatory statements against him. Banks lost the case and was ordered to pay Cadwallader £800,000 in costs. However, in May of 2023, Banks appealed the decision and won the case. For Cadwallader, this meant repaying banks the initial £800,000 paid to her, an extra £400,000 for the 60% loss that banks encountered due to the libel, and a third of his court costs, resulting in £1.2 million. The industry today and its dangerous territory. One of the roles of investigative journalism is covering dangerous events such as wars and violent protests. In 2023, the number of killings of journalists in conflict zones increased by 35.5%, with there being 38 in 2023 compared to 28 in 2022. The job is becoming more and more dangerous, putting journalists at risk. In 2023, there was reportedly 19 killings in Palestine, 3 in Lebanon and 2 in Israel since the beginning of October. Figures like these create a negative picture for the investigative journalism industry and can be a major turn-off for upcoming and developing journalists. I think it's opening the eyes of the public who take journalists for granted. What is being done to protect journalists who work in a dangerous environment? There are many charities seeking to help those who have faced traumatic events during their job. The Rory Peck Trust is one of them. It was set up in 1995 in memory of Rory Peck, who was killed in Moscow in 1993 whilst being a freelance cameraman. They offer psychological support to journalists who have been exposed to violence and traumatic events whilst having therapy funds that assist journalists who have been injured, threatened, imprisoned or detained to help freelancers continue their work. There is also a major issue with investigative journalists facing imprisonment. According to Reporters Without Borders, which is a charity based in Paris, 779 journalists were jailed in 2023 and over 500 of them spent New Year's Eve in prison. These graphs show that China detained 135 journalists for 48 hours in 2023, and 100 of those were still detained by the 19th of December the same year. Reasons for this is because authorities suspected that they're either being spurious, they're fake journalists, or they're promoting anti-state propaganda, sharing disinformation and sedition. This charity works alongside these journalists to save them from unfair imprisonment. The future for the industry. As David Kaplan said, there simply are not enough investigative journalists in the world. It's like trying to cure disease without doctors to diagnose what's gone wrong. The industry has a base salary of £24,000 a year in the United Kingdom. It can also be less depending on experience and qualifications. Therefore, it is an industry for people who are passionate about the subject. The way in which people receive news is constantly changing, but there will always be a demand for news, and the industry will have to adapt to the evolution of journalism. Over the years, we have seen the popularity of newspapers decrease, but we have also seen the popularity of magazines increase, meaning that the industry for journalism is so unpredictable. I feel as though there will always be a place for investigative journalism because the world is always busy creating news. This part of the industry is lucky due to the fact that it isn't niche. Investigative journalists aren't limited to crime and war. There are always opportunities to investigate problems in fashion, business, the environment, comedy. The limit is essentially endless. This is why I believe that the future for this part of the industry is promising. My main interests have always been crime, and I think investigative journalism is an appropriate path to dig deeper and raise awareness for crime issues. I want to be able to entertain yet inform people with my journalism. It is also an opportunity to travel and learn more about the world while educating others and earning a living whilst doing it. Researching this industry has opened my eyes to opportunity I have never considered before, and I hope to use investigative journalism to create documentaries to enable visual learners like me to learn more about the world whilst putting my technology skills to use. I also hope to create a fun side of journalism with my work that influences and inspires others to look into the same career. In a few years' time, I wish to inspire others, just like William Thomas Stead did for me whilst researching into investigative journalism.